Today I'd like to tell you about some of the things that I did during my trip to the UK, specifically while I was staying
In the heart of rural Sussex.
and I'll tell you why I chose to stay in this sweet little country inn that was way off the beaten track. It was a really pleasant walk through some rural villages and along some country roads to this place. This is the Weald and Downland Museum, where their mandate is to rescue and restore rural buildings that are at risk of being torn down. They have all kinds of delightful and eclectic buildings that they've gathered up from around the English countryside and refurbished and brought back to how they may have looked once upon a time. And you can wander around the place, and I especially love these handmade quilts in a Victorian era workers' home. I can just imagine how cramped these conditions might have been, where many of the children in this family would have been sharing beds with their siblings. Now, while I was there, I spent most of my time in this rather fabulous and new building to take a chainmail making workshop. Now, chainmail was something that was used for many hundreds of years to make armor for fighters. It basically protected them from being stabbed with sharp, pointy tools and a mythical creature or two as well. And it eventually fell out of favor because it turns out it's not particularly good protection against things like guns and other modern weapons. The other part of the museum's mandate is to preserve traditional crafts. And nowadays in the UK, there are apparently only 4 professional chainmail makers, and it's considered to be a critically endangered craft. So I spent an afternoon with a whole load of historical reenactors learning how to make chainmail. So to make chainmail, basically you start out with, well, first of all, you make the rings, but somebody had made these for me. So you start out with your metal rings, and then you close some of them up so they're a complete loop, and then the others you leave open, and then you string them together in a very precise sequence. And do not ask me what that precise sequence is. I can barely do it myself, and I definitely don't think I could explain it to someone else. To say nothing off the bit where you try to use 2 pairs of pliers as extensions of your hands. And by the end of the afternoon, I had a short length of rather imperfectly made chainmail, and really no good idea of how to actually make good chainmail. I found myself thinking back to when I was learning how to spin yarn. I took a class to learn how to do that as well. And by the end of the class, just like with my chainmail class, I had no idea what I was doing. I could absolutely not spin yarn. And the teacher said, if you go home and spend 20 minutes a day, every day, just practicing, in 2 weeks you'll be able to spin yarn. I didn't really believe her, but I gave it a try, and sure enough, by the end of 2 weeks, I actually could make yarn. I'm still not very good, but at least I could do it. So I decided to apply the same principle to learning to make chainmail. And my goodness, I can tell you it was a frustrating experience, and I fumbled around a lot. Eventually, I realized that I needed to change my mindset from trying to make chainmail to learning how to make chainmail. And just changing my mindset that little bit made me so much less frustrated that it allowed me to actually practice and eventually be able to make chainmail rather than, throwing everything down in frustration every few minutes. I started to understand the process. My hands became a little bit more comfortable with sticking those tiny little bits of metal through other little bits of metal, and I started to be able to see where they were supposed to go. And slowly, bit by bit, it became easier and easier until eventually I could actually make a string of chainmail. Now, am I ever going to make a whole coat of chainmail for a full-scale human being? Probably not, but I am pretty happy with the bit that I did make. And then after more practice, I had 2 lengths of chainmail. Now one of these is not quite perfect. Can you see the spot where things go a little bit off the rails? It's there if you look carefully. And then I had an idea for how I could use these bits of chainmail. And if you've been watching my videos about my trip to the UK, you'll know that I've been making little stitched portraits of people and characters that relate to my trip. I thought that I'd like to add a portrait of a knight wearing chainmail to my collection. And the little bits of actual chainmail that I made, I thought that they would make a fun frame for my portrait. And I had an interesting idea for how to make this portrait. Now, when you visit medieval cathedrals in the UK, it's quite common to see full-size effigies of knights in their armor, sometimes in stone, sometimes in brass. Now, when I was a child living in the UK, I don't know if I ever mentioned that. I'll tell you more about it in some of the upcoming videos about this trip. Now, when I was a child living in the UK, it was the thing to do to make brass rubbings of these effigies, and I was never very good at it when I was a child, and I'm apparently still not all that good at it. And here's my attempts at a brass rubbing, and here's one made by somebody who's quite a bit better than I am at doing it, and it reminded me of block printed designs, and I decided for this portrait, rather than stitching it, I was going to make my own printed block. I'm carving this white eraser-like material that's really easy to carve using these micro wood carving tools, and I'm actually much better at doing this than I am at making chainmail. Although printing itself is also another mental workout for me because everything is the reverse of what you expect it to be. So here I'm just creating a test print just using a regular rubber stamp pad to see what my print looks like when it gets reversed, because when you're actually doing the carving, it's the opposite of what it's going to look like when you actually do the printing. And then once I've decided that things looked the way that I liked it, I'm printing this with fabric paint now using a roller, because I just want the ink to sit on the top surfaces and not go into any of the grooves. And let's see what that looks like now. It's another test. Here I've painted this piece of fabric with gold paint and then printed right on top of it. And I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. It's not perfect, but it's good enough for me. And here's what it looks like with my chainmail border. I'm pretty happy with that. And what about my brass rubbing? Well, I'm a grown-up now, and although I'm not very good at this, I know that this doesn't have to be the end of this piece, and I can experiment with it. So I got out my watercolor paints and my water brush that has the water in the handle of the brush, and I started painting over top of that wax crayon. I really like to experiment with artwork that didn't work out so well and see what I can do with it. And I think this piece looks a lot better now. Maybe it's still not a great work of art, but I quite like it, and I'll probably add it to my trip sketchbook. Once again, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.